The autumn wind swept through the streets of Brooklyn with a biting chill that seemed to seep through even the thickest jackets. It was the kind of October evening where the sky darkened early, painting the city in shades of amber and deep purple as streetlights flickered to life one by one. The leaves, crisp and golden, tumbled along the sidewalks like scattered memories of warmer days. Inside Angelo's diner, the warmth was a welcome contrast to the cold outside. The small establishment sat on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Union Street, a neighborhood fixture for over 40 years. Its red vinyl booths had seen better days. The chrome edges of the counter were worn smooth by countless elbows, and the black and white checkered floor tiles showed the passage of time in their faded pattern. But there was something honest about the place, something real that the trendy cafes popping up around Brooklyn couldn't replicate. Sophie Martinez moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her ponytail swaying with each step. At 28, she had the kind of face that people instinctively trusted, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, a smattering of freckles across her nose, and an expression of genuine kindness that couldn't be faked. She wore the diner's standard uniform, a light blue dress with a white apron tied around her waist, comfortable sneakers that had seen one too many double shifts, and a name tag that read Sophie in cheerful letters. "More coffee, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, approaching an elderly man who came in every evening like clockwork. "You're an angel, Sophie," the old man replied with a grateful smile, pushing his cup forward. His hands trembled slightly as he did. Parkinson's, she knew, though he never complained about it. "Just doing my job," she said warmly, filling his cup with the fresh pot she'd just brewed. "How's your daughter doing? Did she have the baby yet?" Mr. Harrison's face lit up. "Last Tuesday, a little girl, 7 pounds, 3 ounces. They named her Grace." "That's beautiful," Sophie said, and she meant it. These small connections, these moments of genuine human interaction, were what made the long hours bearable. "Congratulations, Grandpa." She moved to the next table, clearing plates and wiping down surfaces, her mind partially on her tasks and partially running through the calculations she'd been trying to ignore all day. Rent was due in 3 days. Her younger sister Emma's tuition payment for medical school was coming up next week. The electricity bill sat unopened in her tiny studio apartment because she was afraid to see how much it was this month. "Sophie, table 6 needs their check," called Tony, the cook, from behind the counter. He was a bear of a man with a thick Brooklyn accent and a heart bigger than his considerable frame. "On it," she called back, grabbing her order pad and heading to a young couple who'd been sharing a milkshake and gazing at each other with that unmistakable look of new love. As she handed them their bill, she caught sight of the clock. 9:47 p.m. Her shift had started at noon and she was covering for Maria, who'd called in sick. Again. Sophie suspected Maria wasn't actually sick, more likely dealing with her troubled teenage son, but she'd agreed to cover anyway. She always did. The extra money would help, even if her feet felt like they might fall off. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Sophie glanced up to see Mrs. Chen shuffling in, pulling her shopping cart behind her. The elderly woman came in every night for a bowl of soup and a piece of pie. "Your usual spot is open, Mrs. Chen," Sophie said with a smile, gesturing to the booth by the window. It was the same booth Mrs. Chen had been sitting in for the 15 years Sophie had worked here, first as a teenager washing dishes, now as the senior waitress. "You're such a good girl, Sophie," Mrs. Chen said in her accented English, patting Sophie's hand with her weathered fingers. "Your mama, she would be so proud." The mention of her mother sent a familiar ache through Sophie's chest. 3 years gone, and sometimes it still felt like yesterday. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, and Sophie had been there for every moment, learning how to change bandages, how to manage medicine schedules, how to comfort someone in pain. Those skills, learned in the worst period of her life, had stayed with her. "Let me get your soup started," Sophie said softly, squeezing Mrs. Chen's hand before heading to the kitchen. The diner was quieter now, winding down as it approached closing time at 10 p.m. Just a handful of regulars remained, people Sophie knew by name and order. This was her world, small perhaps, but filled with people who mattered, people who depended on her smile, her service, her presence. Tony emerged from the kitchen, untying his apron. "I'm heading out, Soph. You good to close up?" "Yeah, I've got it," she assured him. "Same as always." "You work too hard, kid," he said, not for the first time. "When's the last time you took a day off?" Sophie thought about it and realized she couldn't remember. "I'll rest when I'm dead," she joked. But Tony didn't laugh. That's what I'm afraid of, he muttered. But he didn't push it. He knew her situation, knew about Emma's medical school dreams, knew about the stack of bills that never seemed to shrink, knew about the studio apartment in a building that should have been condemned years ago. Lock up tight, okay? Weird stuff been happening in the neighborhood lately. I always do, Sophie promised. After Tony left, the diner settled into a peaceful quiet, just the soft clink of silverware, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the hum of the vintage jukebox in the corner playing old Sinatra tunes. Sophie moved through her closing routine, refilling coffee, bringing checks, wiping down tables as customers left. By 9:55 p.m., only Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Chen remained. Sophie began her closing duties, flipping chairs onto tables, sweeping the floor, counting the register. Her tips for the day sat in her apron pocket, 67.42s. Not bad. Combined with her hourly wage, it might just cover groceries for the week. Outside, the temperature had dropped further. Sophie could see her breath fog the window as she wiped down the glass door from the inside. The street was quieter now. Most people hurried home to escape the cold. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. She was just reaching up to flip the open sign to closed when she heard it. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the sound of breaking glass. Sophie's head snapped toward the street just in time to see a large black SUV careening down the road, clearly out of control. It swerved violently, jumped the curb, and slammed into a streetlight pole directly in front of the diner with a thunderous crash that shook the windows. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The jukebox had stopped. Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Chen stared in shock. Sophie's hand was still on the door handle. Then training kicked in. Not formal training, but the instincts she'd developed during her mother's illness. The calm that descended when others panicked. "Call 911, she shouted to Mr. Harrison as she yanked the door open and rushed outside. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she barely noticed. Her heart pounded as she ran toward the crashed vehicle. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood. The driver's side door hung open, and she could see a man slumped over the wheel, unconscious but breathing. She could see the rise and fall of his chest, but it was the movement from the back seat that captured her attention. A child, a little boy no more than 6 or 7 years old, with dark curly hair and the biggest brown eyes Sophie had ever seen. He was crying, calling out, "Papa! Papa!" His small hands were pressed against the window and he was trying to open the door, but it was jammed. Sophie didn't think. She just moved. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm going to help you," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She grabbed the door handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The impact had bent the frame. The little boy's cries grew more frantic. "Papa, my papa, your papa is going to be okay," Sophie said, though she had no idea if that was true. "But I need you to be brave for me, okay? Can you do that?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. Sophie looked around desperately. The front passenger door, it might open. She ran around the vehicle, her sneakers crunching on broken glass, and tried that door. It resisted at first, then gave way with a groan of protesting metal. "Okay, baby, I'm coming in to get you," she said, climbing into the vehicle. The smell of gasoline was strong, making her nervous, but the child needed help now. That's when she saw the blood. The little boy was holding his left arm against his chest, and blood seeped between his small fingers. His jacket sleeve was torn, and beneath it, Sophie could see a nasty gash, probably from broken glass. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was bleeding steadily, and the child was clearly in pain and terrified. "Oh, sweetheart," Sophie breathed, her heart breaking at the sight. She pulled off her apron in one swift motion. "I know it hurts, but I'm going to make it better, okay? What's your name?" "Luca," the boy whimpered. "Luca, that's a beautiful name. I'm Sophie." She tore her apron into strips with hands that were steadier than she felt. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Stay calm. They need you to be calm. Luca, I need you to let me see your arm, okay? I promise I'll be gentle." The boy hesitated, then slowly moved his hand away. The gash was about 3 inches long, running along his forearm. Sophie had seen worse during her mother's treatment. The bed sores, the IV mishaps, the complications. She knew this needed stitches, but first, she needed to stop the bleeding. "You're being so brave," she murmured, carefully wrapping the apron fabric around his arm, applying steady pressure. Not too tight. She didn't want to cut off circulation, but firm enough to slow the bleeding. "Do you like superheroes, Luca?" The boy nodded, sniffling. "Well, you know what? Right now you're being just as brave as any superhero, braver even. She tied the makeshift bandage securely, then gently lifted the boy's arm, elevating it to help reduce the bleeding. There we go. See? You're doing great. Luca's cries had quieted to soft whimpers. He looked at Sophie with those huge eyes, and she could see the fear slowly being replaced by trust. My papa, he whispered. Is my papa okay? Sophie glanced at the driver. He was still unconscious, but his breathing seemed steady. The ambulance is coming and they're going to take care of your papa. But right now I need to get you out of here, okay? Can you move your legs? Luca nodded and shifted, wincing slightly. That's my brave boy, Sophie said, carefully unbuckling his seatbelt. She maneuvered him gently, mindful of his injured arm, and lifted him into her arms. He was surprisingly light, all skinny limbs and trembling fear. He immediately buried his face in her shoulder. As Sophie backed out of the vehicle with Luca in her arms, she heard the sirens in the distance. Thank God. She carried the boy a safe distance from the car. That gasoline smell worried her, and sat down on the curb, keeping him cradled in her lap, her hand maintaining pressure on his bandaged arm. You're okay now, she murmured, rocking him slightly. You're safe. It hurts, Luca whimpered. I know, baby. I know it does. But you know what helps when something hurts? Sophie started humming, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her and Emma when they were small. She couldn't remember all the words, but the melody came naturally. Close your eyes and listen to the song, okay? Just listen. Luca's breathing began to slow, syncing with the rhythm of her humming. His small body relaxed slightly against her, though she could still feel him trembling. Whether from pain, fear, or cold, she couldn't tell. Probably all three. Sophie kept singing softly, barely aware of Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Chen standing in the doorway of the diner watching. She didn't notice the small crowd that had gathered, neighborhood residents drawn by the crash. All her focus was on the little boy in her arms, on keeping him calm, on keeping pressure on that wound, on being the steady presence he needed in this terrifying moment. That's when she heard the cars. 3 black SUVs, identical to the crashed one, came racing down the street and screeched to a halt. Doors flew open, and men in dark suits emerged. 5, 6, 7 of them. They moved with military precision, spreading out around the scene with an alertness that made Sophie's instincts prickle with unease. But it was the man who emerged from the middle vehicle that made everything else fade into the background. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive charcoal suit perfectly. Dark hair, slightly longer than business standard, fell across his forehead. But it was his face that struck Sophie. Strong features, sharp jawline, and eyes that were a piercing gray-blue, the color of winter ice. He looked young, early 30s at most, but there was something in his bearing, in the way he moved, that spoke of authority and power beyond his years. The moment he saw the crashed car, his face transformed. The controlled mask cracked, revealing raw panic underneath. His eyes darted frantically until they landed on Sophie and the child in her arms. Luca! The name was torn from his throat and he was running. Actually running across the street, his long legs eating up the distance in seconds. Sophie instinctively tightened her hold on the boy, some protective instinct flaring to life. But then Luca lifted his head from her shoulder. Papa! The boy cried out, and relief flooded his small voice. The man, Luca's father, dropped to his knees in front of them with absolutely no regard for his expensive suit hitting the dirty pavement. His hands reached out, trembling slightly, hovering over his son as if afraid to touch him and cause more pain. Luca, son, I'm here. I'm right here. His voice, though strained with emotion, was deep and rich, with just the faintest trace of an Italian accent. Where are you hurt? Tell me where it hurts. My arm, Papa, Luca said, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. It hurts. The man's eyes finally shifted to Sophie, and she felt the full force of his gaze. Up close, she could see the fear etched into every line of his face, the pallor beneath his olive skin, the way his jaw clenched as he fought for control. What happened? He asked her, and despite the barely controlled panic in his eyes, his voice remained steady. Is he... How bad? He has a cut on his left forearm, Sophie said calmly, professional despite her own racing heart. It's bleeding, but I've applied pressure and elevated the arm. It's going to need stitches, but it's not life-threatening. He's been very brave. She could see the man processing this information, see some of the terror ease from his expression, even as his eyes remained glued to the blood-soaked fabric around his son's arm. The driver, he started to say, Unconscious but breathing steadily when I checked, Sophie reported. The ambulance is almost here. I can hear them. Indeed, the sirens were much closer now, wailing through the night. The man reached out and gently touched his son's face, his large hand cradling the boy's cheek with infinite tenderness. Luca, bambino mio, you're going to be okay. I promise. I've got you now. Papa, I was scared, Luca whispered. I know, son. I know. The man's voice cracked slightly. But you're safe now. You're safe. Then he looked at Sophie again, and this time, she saw something else in his eyes beyond the fear and relief. Gratitude. Deep, profound gratitude. You saved him, he said, and it wasn't a question. I just did what needed to be done, Sophie replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Now that the immediate crisis was passing, she was becoming acutely aware of several things. The blood on her hands and uniform, the way this man was looking at her like she'd hung the moon, the dozen or so intimidating men in suits creating a perimeter around them, the growing crowd of onlookers. You did more than that, the man said quietly. His eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he carefully reached out. May I? Sophie realized he wanted to take Luca, and she nodded, gently transferring the boy into his father's arms, while making sure to keep the injured arm elevated and secure. The man stood fluidly, his son cradled against his chest, one hand supporting Luca's back and the other carefully holding the injured arm steady. He was strong. That much was obvious from the easy way he held the boy, but it was the gentleness that struck Sophie. Such tenderness from someone who radiated such intensity and power. The ambulance turned onto the street, lights blazing, followed immediately by 2 police cars. The scene erupted into organized chaos. Paramedics rushing to the crashed vehicle, officers beginning to ask questions, the suited men forming a protective circle around their boss and his son. A paramedic approached with a medical bag. Sir, let me take a look at the boy. The man, Luca's father, seemed reluctant to let go, but he lowered his son gently onto the paramedic's gurney. The medic began examining Luca's arm, carefully unwrapping Sophie's makeshift bandage. This is good work, the paramedic commented, glancing at Sophie. You medical personnel? No, I learned some things taking care of my mother, Sophie said quietly. The paramedic nodded approvingly and continued working, cleaning the wound and preparing it for transport. He's going to be fine. Definitely needs stitches and will want to check for concussion and other injuries. But you did exactly the right thing. Probably saved him from losing a lot more blood. Sophie felt relief wash over her. She'd been operating on instinct and half-remembered lessons, terrified she might have done something wrong. Miss, one of the police officers was trying to get her attention. We need to get your statement about what happened. Of course, Sophie said, wrapping her arms around herself. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was suddenly aware of how cold she was. Her uniform was ruined, covered in blood, Luca's blood. Her hands were shaking. Officer, give us a moment, came that deep voice. Luca's father had stepped close to her again, and before she could protest, he was shrugging out of his suit jacket and draping it around her shoulders. The jacket was heavy, expensive, and still warm from his body. It smelled like cedar and something spicy. Sophisticated. It was probably worth more than Sophie made in a month. I can't, she started to protest. You're shaking, he said simply, his tone brooking no argument. And you're covered in my son's blood because you saved his life. The least I can do is make sure you don't freeze. Up close like this, Sophie could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the small scar through his left eyebrow. He was devastatingly handsome, but it was the vulnerability in his expression, the fear still lingering in his eyes as he glanced back at his son, that made him seem human. I should get back to work, Sophie said weakly, even though she knew that was absurd. The diner was the last thing she should be worried about right now. The diner is closed, he said, gesturing to where Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Chen had wisely locked the door and turned off most of the lights. And you've done enough work for one night. More than enough. A police officer approached again. Sir, we really need to get statements from both of you. Of course. The man nodded, then turned back to Sophie. I need to go with my son to the hospital, but I'd like to speak with you afterward, to thank you properly. That's not necessary, Sophie said quickly. Something about this whole situation made her nervous. The expensive cars, the men in suits who were clearly more than just casual associates, the way even the police officers seemed slightly deferential to this man. It's very necessary, he said firmly. But I understand if you don't want to wait. May I at least have your name? Your full name? Sophie hesitated. Something told her that giving this man her name would change things, would pull her into something she didn't understand. But how could she refuse when he was looking at her like that? When his son, sweet, brave little Luca, had just been through such a traumatic experience? Sophie, she said finally. Sophie Martinez. Sophie Martinez, he repeated, and the way he said her name, with that slight Italian inflection, made it sound like something precious. I'm Dante Moretti. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sophie took it. His hand engulfed hers, warm and strong, and she felt something electric pass between them at the contact. From the way his eyes widened slightly, he felt it too. Thank you, Sophie Martinez, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for saving my son's life. I owe you a debt I can never repay. You don't owe me anything, Sophie insisted, gently pulling her hand back. I'm just glad Luca is okay. Papa! Luca called from the gurney where the paramedics were preparing to load him into the ambulance. Papa, come with me. I'm coming, son, Dante called back. He looked at Sophie one more time, and she could see him memorizing her face, committing every detail to memory. This isn't over, Miss Martinez. I will see you again. It sounded like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Then he was striding toward the ambulance, powerful and purposeful, pausing only to issue quick instructions to his men in Italian before climbing into the back with his son. The doors closed, and the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Sophie stood there on the curb, wrapped in an expensive suit jacket that wasn't hers, watching the red lights disappear into the night. Around her, the scene continued, police taking measurements, questioning witnesses, examining the crashed vehicle. The driver had been extracted and was also being transported to the hospital, conscious now but groggy. Miss Martinez? A kind-looking female officer approached with a notepad. I'm Officer Chen. Can you walk me through what happened? For the next 30 minutes, Sophie gave her statement, describing the crash, the rescue, Luca's injuries, everything she could remember. Her voice remained steady throughout, though inside she felt like she was still trembling. When it was finally over, when the police had collected her contact information and assured her she'd done nothing wrong, when the crowd had dispersed and the crashed SUV had been towed away, Sophie found herself standing alone on the sidewalk outside Angelo's diner. The street had returned to its normal quiet. The cold wind picked up, blowing fallen leaves in small whirlwinds around her feet. She pulled Dante's jacket tighter around herself and looked down at her ruined uniform, at the blood on her hands. Literally, on her hands. Sophie? Mr. Harrison had emerged from the diner, moving slowly with his cane. Are you all right, dear? I think so, Sophie said, though she wasn't sure that was true. Her mind kept replaying the moment Dante's eyes had met hers, the weight of his gratitude, the promise in his voice. That was a very brave thing you did, Mr. Harrison said gently. Your mother would have been proud. Sophie's eyes stung with unexpected tears. I saw a child who needed help. That's what makes you special, Sophie. You always see who needs help. He patted her arm. Come on, let me call you a cab. You shouldn't be taking the subway this late, not after everything that's happened. I can't afford. Sophie started to protest. I'm paying, Mr. Harrison said firmly. No arguments. You saved that boy's life tonight. Let an old man do this one small thing for you. Sophie was too tired to argue. She let Mr. Harrison make the call, let him walk her to the corner to wait for the cab, let him press a $20 bill into her hand for the fare despite her protests. Get some rest, Sophie, he said as the cab pulled up, and maybe take tomorrow off. You've earned it. Sophie nodded, though she knew she'd be back at work tomorrow. She couldn't afford to take days off, not with rent due and Emma's tuition looming. The cab ride home was a blur. She stared out the window at the passing streets of Brooklyn, seeing but not really registering the familiar sights. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the evening's events over and over. When she finally climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her small studio apartment, exhausted and emotionally drained, she found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, still wearing Dante's jacket. She should take it off, should wash the blood from her hands, should shower and sleep and try to forget this strange, intense evening. But instead she found herself thinking about gray-blue eyes filled with gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. About a little boy with curly hair who'd called her brave. About a man named Dante Moretti who'd said, "This isn't over." Sophie looked at her reflection, at her ordinary face, her tired eyes, her blood-stained uniform, and wondered how a simple act of kindness had left her feeling like she'd just stepped into something much bigger than herself. She didn't know it then, but her life had just changed forever. The moment Dante Moretti had looked at her and vowed to repay his debt, invisible threads had been woven, connecting her fate to his in ways neither of them could have predicted. Outside her window, the Brooklyn night continued on, unaware and uncaring that in a hospital across the city, a powerful man was sitting at his son's bedside, unable to get the image of a kind-eyed waitress out of his mind, unable to shake the feeling that he'd just met someone important, someone worth protecting, someone worth keeping in his life. And in that small moment, in that tiny apartment, Sophie Martinez hung up an expensive suit jacket carefully, treating it with more care than anything else she owned, and whispered a quiet prayer for a little boy named Luca and his father, whose name she would never forget. The night pressed in around the city, full of secrets and possibilities, and somewhere in its depths, decisions were being made that would draw Sophie deeper into a world she'd never imagined, whether she wanted it or not, because Dante Moretti always paid his debts, and he had just sworn to protect her forever. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Sophie's studio apartment, painting weak stripes across her face. She woke with a start, momentarily disoriented, her heart racing from dreams she couldn't quite remember, just fragments of gray-blue eyes and the weight of a child in her arms. Her phone alarm was blaring. 6:30 a.m. She'd overslept by 10 minutes. Sophie groaned and reached over to silence it, her body protesting every movement. Every muscle ached as if she'd run a marathon. Her shoulders were tight, her back stiff, and when she looked down at her hands, she could still see faint stains under her fingernails, despite scrubbing them raw the night before. The events of last night came rushing back. The crash. Luca. The blood. Those intense eyes that had looked at her like she was something precious. Sophie sat up and immediately noticed Dante's suit jacket hanging carefully on the back of her only chair. In the harsh morning light, it looked even more expensive than she'd realized. Fine wool, impeccable tailoring, probably custom-made. She should return it. She would return it, as soon as she figured out how. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma. "Morning. Good luck on your anatomy exam today. You're going to crush it. Love you." Sophie smiled despite her exhaustion and quickly typed back, "You've got this. Remember everything you studied. So proud of you, Emma." The reason Sophie worked double shifts and skipped meals and lived in this shoebox apartment that cost way too much for what it was. Emma, who was brilliant and kind and deserved every opportunity to become the doctor she'd always dreamed of being. Their mother's dream too, before the cancer had stolen that and everything else. Sophie dragged herself out of bed and went through her morning routine on autopilot. The shower was lukewarm. The building's hot water was unreliable at best, but it helped wake her up. She dried off with a threadbare towel and dressed in her spare uniform, since yesterday's was beyond saving. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed dark circles under her eyes and a bruise on her shoulder. She didn't remember getting, probably from carrying Luca. She looked tired. She always looked tired these days. The walk to the diner took 20 minutes. Sophie couldn't afford the subway fare every day, so she walked when weather permitted, saving those few dollars for more important things. The October morning was crisp and beautiful, the kind of day where the sun painted everything gold, and the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. Brooklyn was waking up around her, shopkeepers opening their stores, children heading to school with backpacks bigger than they were, business people rushing to catch trains. Normal life. Sophie's life. She tried to let the normalcy of it all wash away the strangeness of last night, but when she turned onto Fifth Avenue and saw Angelo's diner, she stopped short. The streetlight pole that the SUV had crashed into was gone, completely removed. The sidewalk had been swept clean. There was no broken glass, no debris, no sign whatsoever that anything had happened. Even the small flowers that had been planted at the base of the pole had been carefully transplanted to a new location. It was as if the crash had never occurred. Sophie stood there staring, feeling a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. This kind of cleanup, this thorough, this fast. It would have taken a crew working all night. It would have cost thousands of dollars. "Crazy, right?" said a voice beside her. Sophie jumped and turned to find Maria, her co-worker, standing there with 2 coffee cups. Maria was in her late 40s, a single mother with a teenage son who gave her constant worry lines across her forehead. "When did they do this?" Sophie asked, still staring at the spotless sidewalk. "Must have been overnight. I came by around 6 to drop off my doctor's note." I really was sick yesterday, Soph, I swear, and it was already like this. Maria handed Sophie one of the coffee cups. Peace offering, and thank you for covering my shift. Sophie accepted the coffee gratefully. It's okay, I know you weren't faking. Yeah, well, Tony doesn't believe me. Maria sighed. But forget about me. Are you okay? Mr. Harrison told everyone what happened last night. Said you were a real hero. I'm not a hero, Sophie said quickly, uncomfortable with the label. I just helped a kid who was hurt. You ran toward a crashed car when everyone else was running away, Maria pointed out. That's pretty heroic in my book. They walked into the diner together and Sophie immediately noticed the atmosphere was different. Tony looked up from the grill with concern in his eyes. The morning cook, Pete, gave her a nod of respect. Even Jerry, the grumpy dishwasher who barely acknowledged anyone, said, Good morning, Sophie. Okay, what's going on? Sophie asked, hanging up her jacket and tying on her apron. You're famous, Tony said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the counter toward her. On the house. You need to eat. I'm not hungry. Eat, Tony said firmly. You look like you're about to fall over, and I'm not having you collapse on my floor. Bad for business. Sophie knew better than to argue with Tony when he used that tone. She sat at the counter and picked at the food while Maria filled her in on the morning gossip. Apparently, the whole neighborhood was talking about the crash, about the mysterious cleanup, about Sophie's brave rescue. Mrs. Patterson was saying those were mob cars, Maria said in a hushed voice, leaning in close. Said she recognized them from the old days when her husband worked the docks. Sophie's stomach clenched. Mrs. Patterson watches too many movies. Maybe. But did you see those guys in the suits and that man, the father? Mr. Harrison said he looked important. Dangerous important. He just looked like a worried father to me, Sophie said, though that wasn't entirely true. Even in his panic, Dante Moretti had radiated power and authority in a way that went beyond ordinary wealth or status. The conversation was cut short by the arrival of the morning rush. For the next few hours, Sophie lost herself in the familiar rhythm of work, taking orders, serving food, refilling coffee cups, smiling at customers even when her feet screamed in protest. It was exhausting, but it was also comforting. This she knew how to do. Around noon, during a brief lull, Sophie was wiping down tables when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out and saw a notification from her banking app. Curious, she rarely checked her account because seeing how little was in there was depressing. She opened it and froze. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. There had to be some mistake. Her checking account, which yesterday had contained exactly $347.83, now showed a balance of $23,347.83. $23,000. Just sitting there. Sophie's hands started shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. She checked the transaction history with fumbling fingers and found a deposit made at 3:47 a.m. with a reference number, but no other identifying information. This wasn't possible. This had to be an error. Banks made mistakes, right? Computer glitches happened. She couldn't just have $23,000 appear in her account overnight. But even as she tried to rationalize it, she knew. Deep in her gut, she knew where it came from. Dante Moretti. Sophie, you okay? Maria's voice seemed to come from very far away. You look like you've seen a ghost. I need to make a call, Sophie stammered. Can you cover my section for a minute? Sure, but Sophie was already heading to the back alley where employees went for breaks. Her hands shook as she dialed her bank's customer service number. The wait music seemed to last forever before finally a representative answered. I need to check on a deposit to my account, Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's a large amount, and I think there might have been a mistake. After providing her account information and going through security questions, the representative came back on the line. I'm showing a wire transfer deposit of $23,000 made early this morning. The transfer was legitimate and has been verified. Is there a problem, Ms. Martinez? Can you tell me who sent it? The transfer came from Moretti Holdings, LLC. There's a memo attached that says medical expenses and gratitude. Would you like me to? Sophie hung up. She couldn't breathe. The alley seemed to be spinning around her. $23,000. Medical expenses and gratitude. He'd paid her. Dante Moretti had paid her for saving his son's life. And he'd clearly looked into her finances to know that $23,000 was almost exactly what she needed. Her rent was 2 months behind. That was $2,400. Emma's tuition payment was $18,000. Utilities, groceries, the minimum payment on her mother's remaining medical bills. It all added up to almost exactly $23,000. He knew. He'd investigated her. He knew everything. Sophie felt simultaneously grateful and horrified. Grateful because that money would change her life, would give her breathing room she hadn't had in years, would mean Emma could stay in medical school without Sophie having to work herself to death. But horrified because she hadn't asked for this, hadn't earned it. Not really. She'd just done what any decent person would do. And now she owed Dante Moretti, a man she didn't know, who was clearly far more powerful and connected than she'd realized. And that scared her more than anything. Sophie pulled up the transaction again, staring at those numbers. Part of her wanted to keep it, to accept this miracle and pay off her debts and maybe, finally, sleep through the night without worrying. But another part, the stubborn, independent part that sounded exactly like her mother, knew she couldn't accept this. She wouldn't be bought. She wouldn't be in anyone's debt, especially not someone like Dante Moretti. Decision made, Sophie went back inside. She pulled off her apron and approached Tony at the grill. "Tony, I need to leave early. Family emergency." Tony looked at her with concern. "Is Emma okay?" "She's fine. I need to take care of something important. Please." Tony studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Go." "But Sophie, whatever trouble you're in, you can talk to me. You know that, right?" "I'm not in trouble," Sophie said, though she wasn't sure that was true. "I just need to fix something." She grabbed her jacket and was out the door before Tony could ask more questions. She had no idea where to find Dante Moretti, but she knew where to start. She pulled out her phone and searched for Moretti Holdings LLC. The results made her stomach drop even further. Moretti Holdings was a massive corporation with interests in real estate, construction, imports, and various other businesses throughout New York and New Jersey. The company was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And at the top of every article, every business profile, every society page photo, was the same face. Dante Moretti, young CEO, philanthropist, and rumored connection to old New York families. The articles were carefully worded, never directly stating anything inappropriate, but the implications were there if you knew how to read between the lines. Old New York families, traditional business interests, the kind of euphemisms that meant exactly what Sophie feared they meant. One of the business addresses listed was an art gallery in Manhattan, Galleria Moretti, located in the upscale Chelsea neighborhood. The description said it specialized in Italian Renaissance art and contemporary pieces, a legitimate business that catered to wealthy collectors. Sophie checked the time. 1:30 p.m. The gallery would be open. The subway ride to Manhattan felt like it took hours, even though it was only 30 minutes. Sophie clutched her phone, checking her bank balance over and over as if the numbers might change, might reveal themselves to be the mistake she desperately hoped they were, but they stayed the same. $23,347.83. Galleria Moretti was located on a tree-lined street in Chelsea, sandwiched between a high-end furniture boutique and a French bistro. The storefront was elegant, floor-to-ceiling windows displaying a single marble sculpture on a pedestal, dramatic lighting, and a discreet bronze plaque beside the door, with the gallery's name in elegant script. Sophie stood across the street for a full 5 minutes, gathering her courage. She was acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her diner uniform and worn jacket, how the people walking past her were dressed in designer clothes and carried bags from stores Sophie had only seen in magazines. But she'd come this far. She couldn't back down now. The gallery door opened with a soft chime. Inside, the space was breathtaking. White walls, polished concrete floors, tasteful lighting that made each piece of art seem to glow. Classical music played softly in the background. The air smelled like lilies and old books. A woman in her 60s, dressed in an impeccable black suit with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, looked up from behind a minimalist desk. "Good afternoon," she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she took in Sophie's appearance. "May I help you?" "I need to speak with Mr. Moretti," Sophie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It's urgent." The woman's smile became slightly cooler. "I'm afraid Mr. Moretti isn't available without an appointment. Perhaps I can help you with something. Are you interested in viewing our collection?" "No, Sophie took a breath. "Please, just tell him Sophie Martinez is here. He'll want to see me." Something flickered in the woman's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. She studied Sophie for a moment longer, then picked up a sleek phone on her desk. "Mr. Moretti, there's a Miss Sophie Martinez here to see you." A pause. "Yes, sir. Right away." She hung up and her demeanor changed completely, the cool professionalism replaced by something warmer. "Mr. Moretti will see you immediately. Please, follow me." The woman led Sophie through the gallery, past paintings that probably cost more than Sophie would earn in her lifetime, past sculptures and installations, to a door at the back marked "Private." She knocked once, then opened it. "Miss Martinez, sir." Sophie stepped through into what was clearly an office, but unlike any office she'd ever seen. It was sophisticated and masculine. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, built-in bookshelves filled with art books and what looked like first editions. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, and behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of Chelsea. And standing by those windows, looking out at the city, was Dante Moretti. He turned when she entered, and Sophie's breath caught. She'd thought maybe her memory had exaggerated how striking he was, how commanding his presence. But if anything, she'd understated it. In the cold light of day, wearing a different suit, this one charcoal gray with a white shirt and no tie, he was even more imposing. But it was his eyes that caught her again. Those gray-blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Sophie Martinez," he said, and there was something in his voice. Surprise, pleasure, relief. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "You were expecting me?" Sophie asked, finding her voice. "I was hoping," he corrected, moving away from the window. "Please, sit." He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk, but Sophie remained standing. She felt like if she sat down, she'd lose what little advantage she had. "I can't accept the money," she said bluntly. "I need you to take it back." Dante stopped, studying her. He didn't look surprised. "Why?" "Because I didn't earn it. I didn't save your son for money. I saved him because he was a child who needed help." Sophie pulled out her phone and showed him the screen with her bank balance. It's too much. It's more money than I've ever had in my life. I can't take it." "You didn't take it. I gave it to you." Dante moved behind his desk but didn't sit. He leaned against it, arms crossed, his posture casual but his eyes intense. "Do you know how much my son means to me, Miss Martinez?" "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." His voice was quiet but firm. "Luca is everything to me. He's all I have left of someone very important. And you saved his life last night. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think about your own safety. You just acted. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious?" Sophie felt her resolve wavering. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Dante said softly. "They wouldn't have. I've learned that most people, when faced with danger or difficulty, they look away. They find reasons not to get involved. But you ran toward that car. You climbed into a vehicle that could have exploded. You held my terrified son and made him feel safe. You stopped his bleeding with your bare hands and your work apron." His voice grew rough with emotion. "So please don't tell me that money is too much. There is no amount of money that could repay what you did." Sophie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "I don't want to owe you anything. You don't owe me anything. I owe you. That's why I'm giving you this money. Not as payment. You can't pay someone for saving your child's life. But as gratitude. As a way of saying thank you when words aren't enough. You investigated me," Sophie said, changing tactics. "You looked into my finances. That's invasive. I don't even know you, and you know everything about me." For the first time, Dante looked uncomfortable. "You're right, and I apologize for that. It was wrong of me to intrude on your privacy, but I needed to know how best to help you. I can see from your records that you work yourself to exhaustion, that you're behind on rent, that you're paying off medical bills from your mother's treatment, that you're supporting your sister through medical school." His expression softened. "You're drowning, Sophie, and I'm offering you a lifeline. Why won't you take it?" "Because accepting feels like giving up control," Sophie wanted to say. "Because I've been independent since my mother died, and taking your money feels like losing that. Because you scare me, not because I think you'll hurt me, but because you make me feel things I shouldn't feel, things I can't afford to feel." But she couldn't say any of that. So instead she said, "I need to be able to take care of myself and my sister. I need to know that I can survive on my own. If I take your money, it feels like I'm weak. It takes more strength to accept help than to refuse it," Dante said quietly. "And you've more than proven your strength. Let me do this one thing for you. Please." Sophie looked at him, really looked at him. Beyond the expensive suit and the powerful presence, she saw something else. She saw a father who'd come close to losing his son. She saw grief in the set of his shoulders, old pain in the depths of his eyes. She saw someone who understood loss because he'd experienced it too. "How is Luca?" she asked suddenly. "Is he okay?" Dante's expression transformed, warmth flooding his features. "He's perfect. 18 stitches, mild concussion, but otherwise fine. He woke up this morning asking about the angel lady who saved him." A small smile curved his lips. "He wants to meet you again, to say thank you properly." Sophie felt her heart squeeze. "I'd like that. Then let me make you a deal." Dante moved around the desk, closer to her, not invading her space, but close enough that she could see the darker ring around his irises, the faint scar through his eyebrow. "Keep the money. Use it to catch up on your bills, to help your sister, to give yourself a little breathing room. In return, you come to dinner at my home. Let Luca thank you. Let me thank you. And after that, if you still want to pay me back somehow, we'll figure something out, but at least give us, a chance to express our gratitude properly." "I don't think that's a good idea," Sophie said, even as part of her wanted to say yes. "Why not?" "Because," she struggled to put it into words, "because you're you, and I'm me, and we're from completely different worlds. Because I know what you probably are, what Moretti Holdings really means. Because getting involved with you, even just for dinner, feels dangerous." Dante's jaw tightened. "I would never let any harm come to you. You have my word on that. But can you actually promise that?" Sophie asked. "Can you honestly tell me that being around you is safe?" For a long moment Dante said nothing. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "No," he admitted. "I can't promise you that. My life is complicated. There are people who would love to hurt me by hurting the people I care about, but—" He held up a hand when Sophie started to speak. "But that's why I need to protect you. The men who hurt Luca yesterday, who caused that crash, they saw you. They know you helped my son, and that makes you a target whether you accept my help or not." Sophie felt ice water flood her veins. "What?" "I'm sorry," Dante said, and he genuinely looked sorry. "I wish I could tell you that you're safe to just go back to your normal life and forget any of this happened. But I can't lie to you. There are rivals, enemies, people who would see helping my son as choosing a side. And I will not, leave you unprotected knowing that. So what, I'm supposed to just, what? Let you guard me? Change my whole life because I helped a child?" Sophie could hear her voice rising, panic and anger mixing together. "I have men watching your apartment building, watching the diner. They're discreet, you wouldn't notice them. But they're there making sure you're safe." Dante's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, but his eyes were intense. "This isn't about control, Sophie. This isn't about me having power over you. This is about me using every resource I have to make sure that your good deed doesn't get you hurt." Sophie wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, that he was overreacting. But she couldn't shake the memory of how thorough that cleanup had been this morning, how quickly and completely all evidence of the crash had disappeared. If he had the resources to do that overnight, he had the resources to do anything. "I just wanted my normal life," she whispered. "I know." Dante's voice was gentle. "And I'm sorry that I've disrupted it. But please let me at least try to keep you safe. Have dinner with me and Luca. Let me explain everything properly. Let me show you that I'm not the villain you're imagining." Sophie looked up at him, at this man who'd turned her world upside down in less than 24 hours. She should say no. She should walk out of this gallery, return the money somehow, and never look back. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "One dinner. That's all. I want to see that Luca is okay, and then we'll figure out the rest." The relief on Dante's face was almost painful to see. "Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. But I want something in return," she added, finding a shred of her courage. "I want honesty, complete honesty. No more investigating me without permission. No more making decisions about my safety without talking to me first. If you want to protect me, fine, but I get to be part of those decisions. Deal?" Dante studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Deal." Sophie took it, and again she felt that electric current between them, that awareness that made her breath catch. She pulled her hand back quickly, unsettled by her reaction to him. "I should get back to work," she said. "Keep the money," Dante said as she turned toward the door. "Please, even if you consider it a loan that you'll pay back someday, just let it help you for now." Sophie paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She didn't turn around, but she nodded once. Then she was through the door and walking quickly through the gallery, past the elegant woman at the desk who smiled at her warmly now, past the priceless art, out into the afternoon sunshine. She made it 2 blocks before she had to stop and lean against a building, her whole body shaking. What had she just agreed to? Dinner with a man who was clearly far more dangerous than he appeared, who'd somehow gotten under her skin in the space of one traumatic evening. A man whose eyes haunted her dreams and whose touch made her forget every practical reason she should stay far away from him. Sophie pulled out her phone and looked at her bank balance again. $23,000. Enough to pay her rent, enough to keep Emma in school, enough to finally breathe. She thought about what Dante had said, that it takes more strength to accept help than to refuse it. Was that true? Or was she just rationalizing taking money from a man she barely knew? Her phone rang, making her jump. It was Emma. "Hey, Soph. Just got out of my exam and I think I actually did okay. Want to grab dinner tonight to celebrate? My treat? Well, ramen is my treat, but still." Sophie smiled despite everything. Emma's joy was infectious. "That sounds perfect. But my treat, and maybe we can go somewhere nicer than ramen." "What? Did you win the lottery or something?" "Something like that," Sophie said softly. "I'll explain tonight. Love you. Love you too." After they hung up, Sophie stood there on the Manhattan sidewalk, letting the city flow around her. People rushed past, absorbed in their own lives, their own problems. None of them knew that her life had just changed completely. None of them could see the invisible threads being woven, connecting her to Dante Moretti in ways she didn't fully understand yet. But she could feel them, those threads, that connection. And despite all her logical reasons to be afraid, despite all the warnings her practical mind was screaming, there was a small traitorous part of her that was curious, that wanted to know more about the man with the gray-blue eyes and the tender way he held his son. The man who'd looked at her like she was something precious. Sophie pushed off the building and started walking toward the subway. She had to get back to work, had to maintain some semblance of normalcy even as everything around her shifted and changed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross, that by accepting Dante's money, by agreeing to that dinner, she'd stepped into his world, whether she meant to or not. And somewhere across the city, in an elegant office in an art gallery, Dante Moretti stood at his window and watched the streets below. A small smile played at his lips as he thought about brown eyes full of defiance and kindness, about a woman who'd looked at him without fear even when she probably should have been afraid. He'd told her he owed her a debt. What he hadn't told her was that he had no intention of ever letting her go. That the moment he'd seen her cradling his son, something had shifted in his chest, something he hadn't felt since he'd lost his wife. Protection, he'd told her. Safety. Those were true enough, but they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Sophie Martinez had touched something in him he'd thought died with Maria, his late wife, Luca's mother, the woman who'd known him before power and responsibility and weight of his family name had shaped him into something harder, colder. And now, against all logic and reason, he wanted to know if that part of him could wake up again. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Marco, I need you to increase security around Miss Martinez. Double the men. I want eyes on her at all times, but discreet. She's not to know they're there unless absolutely necessary." He paused. "And Marco, find out everything you can about the Castellano family's movements yesterday. I want to know who gave the order for that ambush." There was a pause on the other end, then Marco's gravelly voice. "Boss, are you sure about this, getting involved with a civilian, especially now? I'm not asking for your opinion, Marco. I'm giving you an order." Another pause. "Understood. But boss, this girl, she's not like the others. She's genuine. Good. Don't drag her into our world unless you're serious about keeping her there." Dante looked out at the city, at the millions of lives intersecting and diverging in an endless dance. "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I have to protect her. She's too good for this world, Marco, but I'm selfish enough to want her in it anyway." He hung up and stood there as the afternoon light shifted, painting his office in shades of amber and gold. In the distance, he could see Brooklyn, could imagine Sophie going back to her diner, back to her small apartment, back to the life she'd built from sacrifice and strength. But she was his now. She just didn't know it yet. And Dante Moretti always protected what was his. Across the city, unaware of the decisions being made, Sophie arrived back at Angelo's diner to find Tony watching her with concerned eyes. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Sophie looked at him. This man who'd given her a job when she desperately needed one, who'd covered her shifts when her mother was dying, who'd become something like a father figure in the absence of her own. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I will be. I have to be." Tony studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just remember, Sophie, you got people who care about you. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." Sophie smiled, but it felt fragile. "I know. Thank you, Tony." As she tied on her apron and went back to work, serving coffee and taking orders and pretending everything was normal, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. Behind her, the door opened with its familiar chime. She didn't turn to look. Just another customer, just another normal moment in her normal life. Except one of Dante's men had just walked in, taking a seat at the counter with a clear view of the whole diner. He ordered coffee and pulled out a newspaper looking like any other customer. But Sophie felt eyes on her back, felt that weight of protection settling over her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She was being watched, guarded, protected, and she wasn't sure if that made her feel safer or more trapped. The debt unpaid hung between them, invisible but tangible, and with each passing hour, it grew heavier, more complicated, more impossible to escape. Sophie had saved Luca's life, and in doing so she'd bound herself to Dante Moretti in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The only question now was whether that bond would save them both, or destroy everything they'd worked to build. 3 days had passed since Sophie's visit to the gallery, and life had settled into an uneasy new rhythm. She went to work, came home, and tried to ignore the suited men who always seemed to be nearby, reading newspapers at corner cafes, walking past her building at regular intervals, sitting in cars with tinted windows. Dante had been true to his word about discretion. If she hadn't been looking for them, she might not have noticed. But she was looking, and their presence was both comforting and suffocating. The money sat in her account, untouched except for the rent payment she'd finally allowed herself to make. Her landlord had been shocked when she'd paid not just this month, but the 2 months she'd been behind. The relief on his face had made her feel less guilty about accepting Dante's help. It was Thursday evening, and Sophie was closing the diner alone. Tony had left early for his daughter's school play, and Maria had taken the early shift. The October night had turned cold and rainy, the kind of weather that kept customers away and made the diner feel emptier than usual. Sophie was wiping down the last table when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. A car will pick you up from your apartment. Luca is very excited to see you. Dante." Sophie stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. She should be annoyed at his presumption. He hadn't asked, just assumed she'd be available. But beneath the irritation was something else. Nervousness, anticipation, curiosity about seeing little Luca again, about seeing Dante in his own environment. She typed back, "I'll be ready." His response came immediately. "Thank you, Sophie." She pocketed her phone and finished her closing duties, locking the front door and stepping out into the rain. Her umbrella was broken, it had been for weeks, so she pulled up her hood and started walking. The street was deserted, rain creating a curtain that muffled sound and obscured vision. Sophie's sneakers splashed through puddles as she hurried toward home, eager to get out of the cold. She was halfway down the block when she noticed the footsteps behind her. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just another person walking home in the rain. But when she sped up, the footsteps sped up too. When she slowed, they slowed. Sophie's heart began to race. She thought about the protection Dante had promised, about the men who were supposed to be watching her. Where were they now? She turned onto her street, walking faster, her keys already in her hand. Just 2 more blocks to her building. 2 blocks and she'd be safe. "Miss Martinez." The voice came from behind her, male and unfamiliar. Sophie spun around to find 2 men standing under a streetlight. They were young, maybe 30, dressed in expensive coats that were already soaked through. But it was their faces that frightened her. Cold eyes, calculating expressions. "We just want to talk," one of them said, taking a step forward. "I don't know you," Sophie said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at bravery. "Leave me alone." "We know about you and Moretti," the other man said. "About how you helped his kid. Very touching, very noble." Sophie's mind raced. These were the rivals Dante had warned her about. The ones who'd caused the crash. The ones who might want to hurt her because she'd helped Luca. "I'm just a waitress," she said, backing away. I don't have anything to do with Mr. Moretti. I just helped an injured child, that's all. That's all, the first man repeated mockingly. You think it's that simple? You think Dante Moretti gives $23,000 to just anyone? They knew about the money. Of course they knew. Sophie turned and ran. She heard them behind her, their footsteps pounding on the wet pavement, but she didn't look back. Her building was right there, just 50 feet away. If she could just make it inside. A car screeched around the corner, its headlights blinding in the rain. Sophie stumbled, falling to her knees on the sidewalk, bracing for impact. But the car stopped inches from her. Doors flew open and suddenly there were more men. Dante's men, she recognized one from the diner, stepping between her and her pursuers. You need to leave, one of Dante's men said calmly. Now. This isn't over, one of the rivals spat. Tell Moretti. You can tell him yourself, if you're brave enough. Dante's voice cut through the rain like a blade. Sophie looked up to see him striding toward her, his expression thunderous. He was soaked, his expensive coat darkened by rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, but he'd never looked more imposing. The rival men exchanged glances, then retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. Dante dropped to his knees beside Sophie, his hands gentle as they helped her up. Are you hurt? I'm okay, Sophie managed, though she was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. I just fell. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're terrified. Dante pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders just like he had 3 nights ago. Come on. We're getting you out of here. My apartment isn't safe anymore. Not tonight. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as her knees wobbled. Trust me, Sophie. Please. Sophie was too shaken to argue. She let him guide her to the car, let him settle her in the back seat beside him, let him give quiet instructions to the driver in Italian. As the car pulled away from her building, Sophie watched her street disappear in the rain, and she had the strangest feeling that she was watching her old life disappear with it. I'm sorry, Dante said quietly. I should have had more men on you. I should have anticipated they'd make a move. You can't control everything, Sophie said, finding her voice. And your men did come. They stopped it before anything happened. That's not good enough. Dante's jaw was tight with anger. Not at her, she realized, but at himself. You were in danger because of me. Because you helped my son. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. My home. He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes intense in the dim car light. I know you value your independence. I know you didn't want this, but please, just for tonight, let me keep you safe. Sophie nodded slowly. She was too tired to fight, too scared to insist on going back to her apartment. And truthfully, the thought of being alone tonight terrified her more than the thought of accepting Dante's protection. The drive took them out of Brooklyn, across the bridge into Manhattan, then north into a neighborhood Sophie recognized as one of the most exclusive in the city. The buildings here were old-money elegant, with doormen and marble lobbies and the kind of security that didn't advertise itself. But Dante's car kept going, finally pulling up to a townhouse that took up an entire corner. It was beautiful. 4 stories of historic brownstone with tall windows glowing warm against the rainy night. This is your home? Sophie asked, staring. This is where Luca and I live, Dante confirmed. Come, let's get you warm and dry. Inside, the house was even more impressive. High ceilings, crown molding, hardwood floors that gleamed in the soft lighting, art on the walls. Real art, the kind Sophie had seen in the gallery, comfortable furniture that managed to be both elegant and welcoming. An older woman appeared in the hallway, concern on her kind face. Mr. Moretti, is everything... She stopped when she saw Sophie drenched and shivering. Oh, you poor dear. Rosa, this is Sophie Martinez. Sophie, this is Rosa, who keeps Luca and me from complete chaos. Dante's voice was gentle now, the anger fading. Could you draw a bath for Sophie and find her some dry clothes? Of course, come with me, dear. Rosa took Sophie's hand, her touch maternal and comforting. Sophie glanced back at Dante, suddenly reluctant to leave his presence. I'll be right here, he promised. Go get warm, then we'll talk. Rosa led Sophie upstairs to a guest room that was bigger than Sophie's entire apartment. The attached bathroom had a large soaking tub, which Rosa filled with hot water and bath salts. Take your time, Rosa said kindly. I'll leave some clothes on the bed. They're from, well, they should fit you. After Rosa left, Sophie sank into the bath and let the hot water thaw her frozen limbs. Her mind kept replaying those men's faces, their cold eyes, the moment she'd fallen and thought she might actually be hurt. This was real. The danger Dante had warned her about wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, and it had found her despite all his precautions. Tears mixed with bathwater as Sophie finally let herself cry. From fear, from relief, from the overwhelming strangeness of everything that had happened since that October night when she'd saved a little boy's life. When she finally emerged, she found clothes laid out on the bed, soft leggings, a cashmere sweater, thick socks. The sweater still had a tag on it. Rosa had said they would fit, but these were clearly new, probably purchased specifically for her. Sophie dressed and made her way downstairs, following the sound of quiet voices. She found Dante in what appeared to be a study, speaking in Italian to a distinguished older man with silver hair. Dante looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened. "Sophie, feeling better?" "Yes, thank you." She felt awkward, out of place in this beautiful home in borrowed clothes. "I don't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting. This is Marco, my associate." "Marco? Sophie Martinez." Marco's sharp eyes assessed her quickly. "Miss Martinez, it's good to finally meet you. Dante hasn't stopped talking about you since that night." "Marco," Dante said warningly. "I'm just saying what's true, boss." Marco's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I'll leave you two to talk. Miss Martinez, it was a pleasure." After Marco left, silence filled the room. Sophie stood uncertainly by the door while Dante poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Brandy," he explained, offering her one, "for the shock." Sophie accepted it gratefully, taking a small sip. The liquid burned pleasantly down her throat, spreading warmth through her chest. "I'm sorry about tonight," Dante said again. "This is exactly what I was trying to prevent." "It's not your fault," Sophie insisted. "You warned me. I didn't really believe it until tonight. And now I'm scared," she admitted, "and angry, and confused. I just wanted to help a child, and now my whole life is upside down." Dante moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I know, and I wish I could make this easier for you, but I meant what I said. I will protect you, whatever it takes." "Why?" Sophie looked up at him, searching his face. "Why do you care so much? It can't just be about gratitude." For a long moment Dante said nothing. Then he reached out and gently tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Because when I saw you holding my son," he said quietly, singing to him while he bled, keeping him calm when he was terrified, "I saw something I thought I'd lost forever. Goodness. Genuine, selfless goodness. And he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I can't let that be destroyed because you crossed paths with my world." Sophie's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes, at the vulnerability in his voice. "Papa?" They both turned to find Luca standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He wore dinosaur pajamas and his dark curls were mussed from sleep. But when he saw Sophie, his whole face lit up. "It's you, it's my angel." Before Sophie could respond, Luca was running across the room and throwing his arms around her waist. Sophie dropped to her knees instinctively, returning the hug, feeling the little boy's warmth and trust. "Hi, Luca," she said softly. "How's your arm? See?" He pulled back and proudly showed her his bandaged forearm. "The doctor gave me 18 stitches. That's a lot." "That is a lot. You were very brave. Papa says you were braver. Papa says you saved my life." Luca's big brown eyes were serious now. "Thank you." Sophie felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You're very welcome, sweetheart." "Luca, what are you doing out of bed?" Dante asked, but his voice was gentle, indulgent. "I heard voices. I wanted to see if Sophie was really here." Luca looked between them hopefully. "Is she staying for dinner tomorrow?" "Please say yes, Papa." "If Sophie wants to," Dante said, looking at her with that same intensity that made her heart race. Sophie looked at this little boy who'd somehow captured her heart, at his father who terrified and intrigued her in equal measure, at this beautiful home that felt more welcoming than anywhere she'd been in years. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'm staying." And in that moment, watching Luca's delighted smile and the relief in Dante's eyes, Sophie knew she'd just made a choice that would change everything. She just wasn't sure yet if it would change things for better or worse. 6 months had passed since that rainy October night when Sophie's world had changed forever. The threat from the Castellano family had been resolved not through confrontation, but through negotiation. Dante had brokered a peace agreement, offering business concessions in exchange for leaving Sophie untouched. It had cost him, but as he'd told her one quiet evening, some things are worth any price. Sophie still worked at Angelo's diner, her choice. The normalcy of it grounded her, reminded her of who she was. But now she lived in Dante's townhouse, in a beautiful room that had become truly hers, filled with books and plants and morning sunlight. She'd enrolled in nursing classes online, pursuing the dream she'd set aside years ago. Dante had insisted on paying, and this time Sophie had accepted with grace. Emma was thriving in medical school, unaware of the full story but grateful for her sister's sudden good fortune. Tonight Sophie sat in the garden behind the townhouse, watching Dante push Luca on a swing set he'd had installed. The little boy's laughter filled the spring air, pure and joyful. "Higher, Papa! Higher!" Dante caught Sophie's eye and smiled, that rare, genuine smile he reserved for moments like these, for family, because that's what they'd become, not through blood, but through choice, through shared dinners and bedtime stories, through Luca's school plays and Sophie's study sessions at the kitchen table, through quiet conversations late at night when Dante let his guard down and showed her the man beneath the power. They hadn't rushed into anything romantic, both too cautious, too aware of what was at stake. But the connection was there, undeniable, growing stronger each day. Luca jumped off the swing and ran to Sophie, throwing himself into her lap. "Did you see how high I went?" "I saw. You were flying." Sophie hugged him close, breathing in his little boy scent of grass and sunshine. Dante sat beside them, his hand finding Sophie's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Sophie looked at this life she'd never planned, this family she'd never expected, this love that had grown from a single act of kindness on a cold October night. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy." And she was. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. Dante's world still had its dangers, its complications, but they faced them together now. Sophie had saved Luca's life that night, but in doing so, she'd saved something in Dante too, and he'd saved something in her, the ability to trust, to love, to believe that sometimes the scariest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. Luca looked up at them, his hand reaching for Dante's free one, completing their circle. "I love you both," he announced with a child's simple honesty. "We love you too, bambino," Dante said softly. Sophie met Dante's eyes over Luca's head, seeing her own feelings reflected there. Not just gratitude anymore, not just protection, but something deeper, truer, worth fighting for. She'd been afraid of his world, but she'd found her place in it anyway, and Dante Moretti had kept his promise. He'd protected her forever, not just from danger, but from loneliness, from struggle, from a life lived only for others. He'd given her a family, and she'd given him hope.